What if I told you the most dangerous man in rock and roll was finally stopped by something as small as his own fingers? Not heroin, not prison, not falling out of a tree in Fiji and needing brain surgery, not the decades of cigarettes, alcohol, and chaos that made Keith Richards look less like a human being and more like a science experiment that somehow learned guitar. His fingers. In late 2025, rumors started spreading that the Rolling Stones were quietly pulling back from touring. Then came the real shock. Plans for a massive 2026 European tour were suddenly canceled. Fans immediately started asking the same question. Was Keith Richards finally done? And honestly, after everything this man survived, that question almost sounded ridiculous. This is the guy who wrote Satisfaction in his sleep. Literally. Keith woke up in the middle of the night in 1965, recorded a rough guitar riff into a tape recorder, went back to bed, and accidentally created one of the most famous songs ever made. That riff became the sound of rebellion for an entire generation. Then he followed it with Jumpin Jack Flash, then Gimme Shelter, then Brown Sugar. One after another, Keith Richards kept creating riffs so powerful they sounded less like songs and more like events. 5 guitar notes from Keith could do more damage than entire albums from other bands. And that is what made the news so strange. Because for over 60 years, Keith Richards survived things that should have buried him long ago. In 1965, he was electrocuted on stage in Sacramento after touching a microphone with a badly grounded guitar. Witnesses said, sparks exploded across the stage, and Keith flew backward unconscious. Most people would have slowed down after that. Keith somehow became even more Keith. But it gets crazier. In 2006, he fell out of a tree while vacationing in Fiji and suffered a brain injury serious enough to require surgery. Newspapers around the world immediately started preparing obituaries. Fans thought this was finally the end of the ultimate rock survivor. 2 months later, he was back on stage performing with the Rolling Stones like nothing happened. That became the story of Keith Richards. Every single time the world thought he was finished, he came back louder. And here's where it gets wild. For decades, people treated Keith like he was immortal. There were actual rumors that doctors secretly replaced all his blood in Switzerland to keep him alive. The story spread around the world because honestly, it sounded believable coming from Keith Richards. Years later, Keith finally admitted the whole thing was fake. He made it up because reporters kept asking him stupid questions about drugs. That was Keith, half outlaw, half comedian. Fully impossible to predict. But underneath all the cigarettes, scarves, rings, and attitude was something much simpler. A kid from England who became obsessed with guitar. And that story starts in wartime Dartford with a grandfather, a dusty guitar on a shelf, and one train ride that changed music forever. Keith Richards was born in 1943 in Dartford, Kent. During the middle of World War II, Britain was still covered in bomb damage, food rationing, and exhausted families trying to rebuild normal life. Nothing about Keith's childhood looked glamorous. His father, Bert, worked in a factory after returning from the war, and money was always tight. But there was one thing inside the Richards house that completely hypnotized young Keith: a guitar. It belonged to his grandfather Gus, a jazz musician who understood something important about kids. If you force them towards something, they run away. But if you make it feel mysterious, they chase it forever. So, Gus kept the guitar sitting high on a shelf where Keith could see it, but not reach it. Every time Keith stared at it, Gus would grin and tease him a little more. And eventually, it worked. Keith finally got his hands on the instrument around age 12, and from that moment on, his life basically locked onto one track. Years later, Keith said there was never a backup plan after guitar entered the picture. No college dream, no normal career, nothing. Just music. At first, he became obsessed with American blues records. Chuck Berry, Muddy Waters, Bo Diddley, Little Richard. To Keith, that music sounded dangerous, raw, alive. British radio at the time was full of clean, polished singers wearing suits. American blues sounded like the complete opposite. It sounded rebellious. And then came the moment that changed rock history forever. In 1961, Keith boarded a train at Dartford station, carrying records under his arm. Another teenager noticed them immediately because almost nobody else in England his age even knew those artists. That teenager was Mick Jagger. Now, here's the insane part. Keith and Mick actually knew each other as children years earlier before losing touch completely. Out of pure chance, they reconnect on a random train because of blues records. And once they started talking, they basically never stopped. The two bonded instantly over music obsession, not casual interest. Obsession. They spent hours studying blues musicians the way athletes study game footage today. Every guitar lick, every vocal trick, every rhythm. Soon they connected with Brian Jones, Charlie Watts, and Bill Wyman. Together they formed a blues band named after a Muddy Waters song, the Rolling Stones. At first, nobody thought the band would last. Not the audience, not the industry, not even the Stones themselves. Keith later admitted the group assumed they had maybe 2 years before they would need real jobs. Instead, they became the dangerous alternative to the Beatles. The Beatles wore matching suits and smiled for cameras. The Stones looked like they had just been kicked out of a bar fight. Parents hated them immediately. Teenagers loved them even more for exactly that reason. But what if I told you the song that transformed the Rolling Stones into global superstars almost never existed at all? Because the riff that made Keith Richards immortal was recorded half asleep in the middle of the night. And Keith almost erased it without realizing what he had done. By 1965, the Rolling Stones were already becoming famous. They had hit songs, screaming fans, sold-out shows, and a reputation that terrified parents across Britain and America. But Keith Richards still had not written the riff that would change everything. Then, one night in Florida, something strange happened. Keith woke up in the middle of the night with a guitar beside his bed and a portable tape recorder nearby. Half asleep, barely conscious, he played a short riff into the recorder before immediately passing out again. The next morning, he listened back to the tape. At first there was silence. Then came the riff. Da da da, da da, da da da. After about 2 minutes, the tape captured the sound of Keith snoring. That rough little guitar idea became I Can't Get No, Satisfaction. And music basically split into two eras. Before that riff and after it. The song exploded worldwide almost instantly. #1 in America, #1 in Britain. Suddenly, the Rolling Stones were not just another successful band anymore. They became cultural chaos. Dangerous, rebellious, loud. Everything parents feared their kids were becoming in the 1960s. And Keith loved every second of it. But wait, because success started creating a completely different problem. The bigger the Stones became, the more pressure landed on Keith and Mick Jagger to keep producing impossible hits over and over again. Most bands would collapse under that kind of expectation. Instead, Keith somehow got better. In 1968, he created the riff for Jumpin Jack Flash, one of the most explosive openings in rock history. The song sounded huge, dirty, and aggressive. It was the sound of the Rolling Stones fully transforming into the band people still picture today. Then came Sympathy for the Devil, then Street Fighting Man, then Gimme Shelter. And let me tell you this.
And his ministers, Anastasia.
Gimme Shelter might be the most haunting rock song ever recorded. The entire track sounds like the world ending in slow motion. War, violence, fear, chaos. Even today, it still feels unsettling. Decades later, directors keep using it in movies because nothing else creates that same feeling. But while the Stones were becoming larger than life in public, Keith Richards was becoming increasingly reckless and private. Drugs flooded into the band's world fast. Marijuana first, then harder substances, then heroin. And here is where the Keith Richards mythology really began. Police raids, wild parties, hotel destruction, endless headlines. Keith stopped looking like a normal musician and started looking like the physical human form of rock and roll itself. Scarves, jewelry, cigarettes, eyeliner, tangled hair. He looked dangerous before he even picked up a guitar. In 1967, police raided Keith's house in Sussex after rumors spread about drug use inside the home. Newspapers had a field day with the scandal. Suddenly, the Rolling Stones were not just controversial musicians anymore. They became public enemies. And the craziest part? The scandals only made them more famous. But what nobody realized yet was that Keith Richards was heading toward a level of addiction so serious it nearly destroyed not just the Rolling Stones, but Keith himself. By the mid-1970s, Keith Richards was disappearing into heroin addiction so deeply that even people close to him thought he might not survive. This was no longer the fun, rebellious rock star image magazines loved selling. Keith was spending thousands of dollars every week feeding the addiction. Recording sessions slowed down. Tours became unpredictable. Some nights he looked barely conscious walking onto stage. And somehow, the music still kept coming. That is the insane thing about Keith Richards. Even during the darkest years, he continued creating songs that became classics. Albums like Exile on Main Street sounded chaotic, dirty, and alive, partly because the band itself was chaotic, dirty, and barely holding together. The recording sessions in France became legendary. The Stones had fled England after massive tax problems and rented a mansion called Nelcote on the French Riviera. It looked glamorous from the outside. Inside, it was complete madness. Drug dealers wandered through the halls. Famous musicians showed up at random hours. Recording equipment filled the basement while people slept on floors upstairs. Keith turned the villa into what some people called a pirate kingdom for rock stars. And out of that mess came songs like Tumbling Dice, Rocks Off, and Happy. But wait, because by 1977, the chaos finally caught up to him. Keith was arrested in Toronto after police found heroin in his hotel room at the Harbour Castle Hotel. This was not a small celebrity scandal. Canadian authorities charged him with trafficking, and suddenly Keith Richards was facing the possibility of years in prison. For the first time in his life, the jokes stopped feeling funny. Even Keith later admitted this was the moment everything became real. Because now he faced a brutal choice: drugs or music. And here's the thing most people misunderstand about addiction. People imagine some dramatic movie moment where a person suddenly changes overnight. Real life is uglier than that. Slower, harder. Keith did not magically become healthy the next morning, but something inside him shifted. He realized there was one thing he truly could not live without. Not heroin, music. The guitar mattered more. That realization probably saved his life. Getting clean was miserable. Keith later described the process like surviving a war inside his own body. But during that same period, something unbelievable happened that almost sounds fictional. A blind Rolling Stones fan from Toronto personally went to the judge handling Keith's case. Not the courthouse, the judge's actual home. She explained how Keith had quietly helped her attend concerts safely for years because he worried something bad might happen to a blind fan traveling alone. The judge listened. Instead of prison time, Keith received probation and was ordered to perform a charity concert for the Canadian National Institute for the Blind. That concert changed everything. Keith never forgot the woman who helped save him. He later called her his blind angel. And honestly, if that story happened in a movie, people would complain it sounded too unrealistic. But what came next was far darker than prison. Because while Keith Richards was surviving addiction and rebuilding himself, tragedy hit his family in a way that nearly destroyed him completely. In 1976, Keith Richards received the kind of phone call that splits a life into before and after. His 10-week-old son, Tara, had died suddenly in Switzerland while Keith was in Paris preparing for a Rolling Stones show. Just like that, he was gone. And this is where the Keith Richards story stops sounding like a rock documentary and starts sounding painfully human. Because behind all the headlines, the drugs, the riffs, and the swagger, was a father hearing the worst sentence imaginable. Most people would not have been able to function after that call. Keith still walked on stage that night, not because he was cold, not because he did not care. Actually, the opposite. Years later, he admitted that if he had stopped moving, if he had sat alone in a room thinking about what happened, he probably would not have survived the night mentally. So, he played. Imagine trying to perform in front of thousands of screaming fans while your brain is completely shattered. Imagine hearing applause while your entire world quietly collapses inside your chest. That loss never really left him. Even decades later, Keith rarely spoke about Tara publicly for very long. You can almost hear him emotionally pulling back whenever interviews get too close to the subject. But what if I told you another family story somehow became one of the strangest legends in rock history? Because Keith Richards later shocked the entire world with a story involving his father's ashes. Now at first, Keith and his father Bert were not close for many years. After Keith became famous and left home in the early 1960s, the two barely spoke for almost 2 decades, 20 years of silence. Then in the early 1980s, Bert unexpectedly showed up backstage at a Rolling Stones rehearsal. Keith was reportedly so nervous about seeing his father again that he brought guitarist Ronnie Wood into the meeting, almost like emotional backup. But the reunion worked, and strangely enough, the older Bert got, the more he seemed to enjoy the wild world surrounding his son. He started appearing backstage at concerts and spending more time with Keith. The relationship healed. Then Bert died in 2002. Keith had him cremated and kept the ashes for years before deciding to plant them beneath an oak tree at his home. Simple enough so far. But here is where it gets wild. Keith later admitted that, while opening the container, some ashes accidentally blew onto the table. Instead of brushing them away, Keith leaned down and snorted them. Yes, actually, the internet exploded. News anchors looked horrified, saying the sentence out loud. Fans debated whether he was joking. Keith insisted he was completely serious. And honestly, the strangest part is that the story somehow felt perfectly on brand for Keith Richards. Disturbing, funny, weirdly emotional, and impossible to imagine happening to anybody else. But underneath all the insanity, something else was happening quietly in the background. Time was catching up to the Rolling Stones. And when drummer Charlie Watts died in 2021, Keith Richards suddenly found himself confronting something he had avoided for decades. The idea that even legends eventually run out of time. Charlie Watts died on August 24th, 2021. And for the first time in decades, the Rolling Stones suddenly did not feel indestructible anymore. Charlie had spent nearly 60 years behind the drums, quiet, calm, completely different from the chaos surrounding the rest of the band. While Mick Jagger looked like a rock star, and Keith Richards looked like he had survived a pirate ship explosion, Charlie Watts looked like a man who should have owned a jazz club somewhere in London. That contrast became part of the magic. Charlie was the anchor. Keith once said the entire Rolling Stones sound depended on Charlie's timing. Not flashy drumming, not giant solos, feel, groove, swing. Charlie played slightly behind the beat in a way that made the Stones sound loose and dangerous at the same time. And when Charlie died, something inside Keith clearly changed. He later admitted the loss hit him harder than people realized. Every morning, Keith walks past a portrait of Charlie hanging near his staircase. First thing he sees every day. That is not rock star behavior, that is grief. But wait, because around the same time, another problem had quietly been growing worse for years. Keith's hands. For decades, fans noticed his fingers starting to bend in unusual directions during performances and interviews. At first, people joked about it online, memes, comments, the usual internet stuff. But the reality was much more serious. Keith Richards had arthritis. Now for most people, arthritis means stiffness and pain. For a guitarist, especially one whose entire legacy depends on finger movement, it can become devastating. The disease slowly changes the joints, reducing flexibility and making certain movements harder over time. And we are not talking about an ordinary guitarist here. These were the fingers behind Start Me Up, Honky Tonk Women, Beast of Burden, songs played in stadiums for generations. In 2023, Keith publicly acknowledged the condition, but his response surprised people. He did not sound bitter. He did not sound defeated. Instead, he basically shrugged. Keith explained that arthritis forced him to adapt his playing style. Some chord shapes became harder. Certain movements changed, but instead of fighting reality, he adjusted around it. And honestly, that mindset explains almost his entire life. Keith Richards never survived by pretending damage did not exist. He survived by adapting faster than the damage could stop him. Even in his 80s, he still picked up a guitar nearly every day searching for new sounds. Not reliving the past, not trying to perfectly recreate 1969 forever, just playing. And here's the part that hit fans hardest. When reports surfaced that the Rolling Stones canceled plans connected to a major 2026 European tour, many insiders quietly pointed toward Keith's health and the physical demands of performing. After 60 years, his body was finally asking for limits. But what if I told you Keith Richards still does not talk like someone preparing to disappear? Because even now, after everything, he still speaks about music the same way he did as a kid, staring at that guitar on his grandfather's shelf, like he is still chasing something.